The wind in Wyoming bites different. It's not just cold, it's personal. It carves through your coat and finds your bones. A bitter reminder that the wilderness doesn't care if you live or die. That January morning in 1876, it was slicing through 50 men huddled in Rock Creek's muddy town square, their breath puffed out in ragged white clouds, mingling with the gray, unforgiving sky. In the center of it all stood a gallows, not a proper one, just a wagon, a thick crossbeam, and a rope dangling like a dead snake. Sheriff Maxwell Hayes stood beside it, his face red with whiskey and what he called righteousness. He wasn't a lawman by trade. He was a banker, a saloon owner. He owned the mortgages that kept these men up at night and sold them the whiskey that helped them forget. That was real power in the territory. "Let this be a lesson," Hayes's voice boomed across the square. "Horse thieves get no mercy in Rock Creek." The man on the wagon didn't flinch. His hands were tied, a rough burlap sack pulled over his head, but his shoulders were square. He stood like a man who'd seen worse than a mob of angry ranchers. He stood like a man who wasn't afraid to die. "Hang him!" someone yelled. "String him up!" another voice echoed. The crowd surged, a wave of cold and anger. Then a new sound cut through the jeers. Hoofbeats, a single rider coming from the east, moving with a purpose that silenced everyone. He rode a stallion as black as a coffin, and the crowd just parted for him, like the Red Sea. This man wore no badge, but authority clung to him like trail dust. The army issue colt at his hip wasn't for show. You could just tell. "That's far enough, Hayes." The rider's voice was low, but it hit the sheriff like a physical blow. Hayes squinted. "This ain't your concern, Rollins. This is justice." Captain Ethan Rollins swung down from his saddle in one smooth, practiced motion. His face was a roadmap of hard miles and harder fights. Lines etched around eyes that had seen the devil's work at Gettysburg and Antietam. His left forearm was gone, a souvenir from a Confederate Minié ball, the sleeve of his coat pinned neatly in place. "Justice requires a trial," Rollins said, his boots sinking into the mud as he walked toward the gallows. "Where's the judge? The jury?" "Don't need 'em," Hayes spat. "Caught him red-handed with Simmons's prize mare." Rollins didn't stop. He walked right up to the wagon, climbed the steps, and pulled the burlap sack off the condemned man's head. The prisoner blinked. He was older, maybe 50, with a trimmed silver beard and the kind of intelligent eyes you didn't often see this far west. He looked more like a professor than a horse thief. "What's your name?" Rollins asked, his voice quiet. "Daniel Bennett," the man replied. His accent was pure Boston, a stark contrast to the frontier drawl of the crowd. "I'm an attorney from Massachusetts." Hayes let out a bark of a laugh. "A likely story. He was riding hard for the border when my men caught him." Rollins looked at Bennett. "Is this true?" "I purchased that horse," Bennett said, his voice steady as a rock. "Legally, from a man claiming to be the owner. I have a bill of sale right here in my coat pocket." Before Hayes could even think to object, Rollins reached into Bennett's coat and pulled out a folded piece of paper. He read it, his face unreadable. Then he held it up. "This appears to be a legitimate bill of sale," Rollins announced to the crowd. "Signed by one Thomas Hayes." A gasp rippled through the men. Sheriff Hayes's face went from red to purple. "My brother! That's impossible. Thomas wouldn't sell another man's horse." "Perhaps not," Rollins said, his voice cutting through the tension. "But it does raise a question of reasonable doubt. And in a proper court of law, that's enough to stop an execution." "We ain't in no Eastern court," Hayes roared, but his voice had lost its edge. Doubt was a poison, and Rollins had just injected it straight into the heart of the crowd. Rollins turned, addressing the men directly. "Many of you fought in the war, Union and Confederate. What did we fight for? Was it for mob rule? Or was it to uphold the law of this land?" He let the question hang in the freezing air. A few of the older men, veterans like him, nodded slowly. "There will be a trial," Rollins said, his tone leaving no room for argument. "Mr. Bennett will be held until Judge Morrison returns next month." Hayes took a step forward, his hand drifting toward his pistol. "And who's going to make sure he don't run?" "I will," Rollins said simply. "He'll stay with me. At my ranch." For a heartbeat, the world held its breath. Hayes looked like he might draw. The banker in him, the part that calculates risk, must have won out. He backed down. On your head be it, Captain, Hayes sneered, spitting the rank like an insult. If he runs, you'll hang in his place. Rollins just turned, took out his hunting knife, and with one clean slice cut Daniel Bennett's bonds. I accept that responsibility. As they walked away from the gallows, Bennett leaned in close. Thank you. Not many men would risk their life for a stranger. Rollins' eyes were fixed on the horizon, on the long, cold ride back to his ranch. I'm not doing it for you, he said, his voice hard. I'm doing it for the law. But that wasn't the whole truth. He was also doing it for the ghosts, the men who died under his command, and he was doing it for Sarah and his boy James, whose small graves on the hill behind his house were a constant, silent testament to all the things he'd failed to protect. The ride to Lone Pine Ranch was 16 miles of snow and silence. Bennett, the Boston lawyer, seemed to understand that his rescuer was a man who preferred the company of his own thoughts. It wasn't until they crested a ridge overlooking the vast, empty valley that Bennett finally spoke. They say you were the youngest captain in the 12th Pennsylvania, he said. Distinguished service. Rollins's jaw clenched. War records are just paper. Perhaps, Bennett conceded, but they also say you've built the largest ranch in the territory since the war. 5,000 acres. Land's cheap when you're the only one willing to work it, Rollins replied flatly. He didn't want to talk about the war. He didn't want to talk about the ranch. Both were monuments to things he'd lost. The ranch house came into view, a solid timber fortress against the wilderness, smoke curling from its chimneys. It looked warm. It looked safe. As they dismounted, Mrs. Henderson, his housekeeper, came out onto the porch. She was a stern Scottish woman who'd run his house with military precision since he'd come home. She took one look at Bennett and raised an eyebrow, but she knew better than to ask questions. Prepare the East Room, Rollins told her. Mr. Bennett is a guest. Another stray, is it? She muttered under her breath. Inside the house was a contradiction. Persian rugs on rough-hewn floors, leather-bound books next to loaded rifles. It was a place built by a man trying to remember civilization in the heart of savagery. You'll be safe here, Rollins said, pouring 2 glasses of whiskey. But make no mistake, if you try to run, I will hunt you down myself. Bennett sank into a chair by the fire. I have no intention of running, Captain. I'm an innocent man. He took a sip of whiskey. And my presence in Rock Creek was no accident. I came west to find someone. Who? A man who saved my life at Gettysburg, Bennett said. A Union officer. I never got his name, but I'd know his face anywhere. A cold knot formed in Rollins's stomach. I've been searching for years, Bennett continued. I believe he now serves as Maxwell Hayes's right-hand man, a man they call Colonel Edward Wade. The glass in Rollins's hand cracked. A thin line of whiskey traced a path down his wrist, looking unnervingly like blood. You know him, Bennett stated, his voice quiet. Wade is no hero, Rollins said, his voice tight with a rage he thought he'd buried long ago. Whatever debt you think you owe him, forget it. You served together? Once, Rollins said, setting the broken glass down. A lifetime ago. Edward Wade. The name was a ghost that had haunted Rollins for a decade. His best friend, his lieutenant, the man he'd trusted with his life, until he found him looting civilian homes near Petersburg. Rollins had called it theft. Wade had called it the spoils of war. The argument that followed left 2 men dead and their friendship shattered. Wade had been transferred, his crimes mysteriously erased from the records. Rollins hadn't seen him again until Wade turned up in Rock Creek, the muscle behind Hayes's criminal empire. Now this stranger, this lawyer from Boston, had brought that ghost roaring back to life. Later that night, as snow began to fall, Rollins stood on his porch, trying to let the cold clear his head. It didn't work. The memories were too sharp. Hoofbeats in the distance pulled him from his thoughts. A young ranch hand, Tom Mallister, from the next spread over, rode into the yard, his horse slick with sweat despite the cold. Mr. Rollins, the boy panted. Indians, a band of Cheyenne. They're camped in your north pasture. Rollins frowned. Cheyenne? Most of them are on the reservation. About 15 of them. Got women and kids, Tom said, twisting his hat in his hands. Pa sent me to warn you. Sheriff Hayes is getting a militia together. He's planning to run 'em off come morning. Rollins' jaw tightened into a hard line. That land was protected by treaty. If they were peaceful, Hayes had no right. Thank your father, Rollins said. I'll ride out at first light. When he went back inside, Bennett was still by the fire, reading one of Rollins' books. Trouble? Bennett asked, looking up. Nothing that concerns you. I couldn't help but overhear, Bennett said, closing the book. Cheyenne on your land. On territory that borders my land, Rollins corrected. Hayes will use any excuse to stir up trouble. Makes him look strong, gives him a reason to grab more land. Precisely, Bennett said. I've been investigating Hayes for 6 months. It's not just intimidation. It's a pattern of systemic land fraud. Rollins stared at the lawyer. You're telling me this now? Because tomorrow, Bennett said, his eyes locking on Rollins, when you ride out to that camp, you'll find their leader is a man named Thomas Iron Wolf. The name hit Rollins like a punch to the gut. Iron Wolf, a Cheyenne scout who'd served with him in the war, a man who had saved his life more than once. They were brothers in all but blood. If that's true, Rollins said slowly, why didn't he come to me for help? Bennett's next words landed like a knife twisting in an old wound. Because your name is on several of the fraudulent land deeds, Captain. He wasn't sure which side you were on. The accusation hung in the air, thick and suffocating. Rollins felt a cold fury rise within him. He'd built his life here on a foundation of honesty, a deliberate rejection of the corruption he'd seen in the war and in men like Wade. To have his name, his reputation, used to steal from his friend, it was unthinkable. I have never taken an acre of land that wasn't bought and paid for legally, Rollins said, his voice dangerously quiet. I believe you, Bennett said, but someone has been forging your signature, and I suspect they're planning something much bigger than land fraud. Something that could start another Indian war. He pulled a folded paper from his boot. It was a map. I found this in Hayes's office, Bennett explained. It shows plans to build a series of dams on the Powder River. It would cut off the water supply to the entire northern reservation. Rollins looked at the map, his military mind instantly grasping the horrific strategy. It was a siege map. He's going to starve them out, Rollins murmured. Force them off the reservation. And when they leave, Bennett added, they'll be considered hostiles. Hayes and his militia will have a legal excuse to slaughter every last one of them. It was genocide disguised as progress, a quiet, systematic extermination hidden behind fraudulent paperwork and river dams. As the full weight of the conspiracy settled over him, a gunshot shattered the night. The window next to Rollins exploded, showering the room with glass. He tackled Bennett to the floor as a second shot splintered the doorframe. The quiet war of paper and ink had just turned hot. It seems my presence here has not gone unnoticed, Bennett gasped from the floor. Rollins was already crawling toward a cabinet, pulling out a Winchester rifle. Stay down. Mrs. Henderson appeared in the hallway, a shotgun held at her hip, as calm as if she were announcing dinner. Back door is secure. The boys are checking the perimeter. Rollins chambered around. Get Bennett to the cellar. Another shot thudded into the log wall of the house. Rollins crept to the shattered window, peering out into the moonlit snow. He could see 3 riders circling the house, firing sporadically. It wasn't a full-blown assault. It was a message. They know I'm here, Bennett said from behind him. Indeed they do, Rollins replied. He sighted down the rifle, tracked the nearest rider, and squeezed the trigger. The man tumbled from his saddle with a cry. The other 2 riders vanished into the darkness. Did you kill him? Bennett asked. Shoulder wound, Rollins said, already reloading. But they'll be back, and they'll bring more men. Mrs. Henderson was already in motion. Extra ammunition in the usual places, she said. Rollins nodded. And send Tom Mallister to Iron Wolf's camp. Tell him Broken Knife stands with his brother again. Her eyebrows shot up at the use of his old Cheyenne name, a name he hadn't used in years. But she just nodded and disappeared. Broken Knife? Bennett asked. Iron Wolf saved my life at the Washita River, Rollins said, his voice grim. We have a history of blood and battle, A bond forged in the kind of fire most men never see. The night went quiet again. Too quiet. Rollins knew that silence. It was the breath a predator takes before it strikes. "We have to move," he said. "Now. They'll be back in force at dawn." "Where can we go?" Bennett asked. "Hayes controls the town." "We're not going to town," Rollins said, grabbing a saddlebag. "We're going to Iron Wolf. We have to warn him." Bennett nodded grimly. "My daughter," he said suddenly. "She's still in danger." Rollins stopped. "Your daughter?" "Clara," Bennett said, pain flashing across his face. "She's been working as Hayes' secretary, undercover, copying documents for my case. If Hayes finds out she's my daughter—" The words hung in the air. A spy in the enemy's camp. A daughter in the viper's nest. The stakes just kept getting higher. "She has a personal reason for stopping Hayes," Bennett continued, his voice heavy. "Her mother was Cheyenne. She was one of the few who survived the Sand Creek massacre." Rollins felt another piece of the puzzle slide into place. This one colder and sharper than the rest. "That's how you know Iron Wolf," Rollins realized. "He's her uncle," Bennett confirmed. "My late wife's brother." The sound of hoofbeats, closer this time, more numerous, cut their conversation short. They were out of time. "The root cellar," Rollins said. "There's a tunnel. It leads to the creek." As they scrambled to gather the last of their things, Bennett grabbed Rollins' arm, his eyes desperate. "Promise me, if something happens to me, you'll get to Clara. She has all the evidence hidden, right under Hayes' nose." Rollins looked at the older man, seeing the weight of a father's fear. He had sworn he would never again be responsible for protecting a family. But the world had a way of pulling you back in. "I'll find her," Rollins promised. The words felt like a military oath. Outside, the first pale light of dawn was breaking, revealing a dozen riders approaching the ranch. At their head was a tall man who sat his horse with the unmistakable posture of a cavalry officer. Edward Wade had come to finish the job himself. The frigid water of Powder Creek was a shock, seeping through Rollins' boots and chilling him to the bone. Behind them, in the distance, smoke was beginning to rise from the direction of Lone Pine Ranch. Wade's men were torching his outbuildings, a final, spiteful message. "Your people?" Bennett panted, struggling to keep up. "They're safe," Rollins said. "Mrs. Henderson knows the drill. They'll scatter and regroup at a line cabin to the north." They moved in silence, Rollins leading them deeper into the foothills, his senses on high alert. He moved like a ghost, leaving almost no trail in the fresh snow. By mid-morning, he called a halt in a small ravine. "Iron Wolf's camp is just over that ridge," he said. "But we approach carefully. The Cheyenne are jumpy these days. They'll shoot first and ask questions later." Just as he said it, a twig snapped. Rollins's hand went to his Colt, but he didn't draw. It was too late for that. They were already surrounded. "Don't move," he said quietly. 4 Cheyenne warriors melted out of the trees, their bows drawn, arrows aimed at their hearts. Their faces were painted for war. Rollins slowly raised his empty hands. He spoke in the halting Cheyenne he remembered from the war. "I seek Thomas Iron Wolf. I am Broken Knife." The lead warrior, an older man with a face like cracked leather, stared at him. "Broken Knife died at the Washita," he said in rough English. "I survived," Rollins replied. He pulled back his left sleeve, revealing the jagged, ugly scar that had earned him his name, a wound he'd taken defending Iron Wolf from a cavalry saber. "And so did your chief." The warrior's eyes flickered to the scar, and he gave a short, sharp nod. "Follow. You make a wrong move. You die." They were led into a hidden valley where a small camp of 15 teepees stood. At the center, a man stood waiting. Thomas Iron Wolf. He was older, his black braids streaked with silver, but he stood as straight and proud as the day he'd ridden scout for the 12th Pennsylvania. He watched them approach, his face a stone mask. Then slowly, he raised his hand in a sign of peace. "Broken Knife," he said, his voice deep and resonant. "The white man's world has not killed you yet." "It's still trying," Rollins replied. A rare smile cracked Iron Wolf's stoic face, and he stepped forward, clasping Rollins's forearm in a warrior's grip. "It is good to see you, my brother." but your timing tells me trouble is not far behind. Trouble has found us both, Rollins said, gesturing to Bennett. This is Daniel Bennett. The lawyer, Iron Wolf nodded. We expected you yesterday. There were complications, Bennett explained. Sheriff Hayes tried to hang me. Iron Wolf's eyes hardened. He moves faster than we thought. Come, we must talk. Inside the chief's teepee, a fire burned, casting a warm glow. Sitting by the fire was a young woman. She was dressed in traditional beadwork, but her eyes were a startling green, and she held herself with a confidence that seemed out of place. This is Morning Bird, Iron Wolf said. My sister's daughter. Rollins nodded a greeting. Your niece speaks our language? He asked Iron Wolf in Cheyenne. The woman answered herself in perfect, unaccented English. Better than you do. Harvard has an excellent language program. Rollins stared at her, confused. Bennett cleared his throat. Captain, there's something you don't know about Morning Bird. The young woman looked at Rollins, her green eyes appraising him. Can he be trusted? With our lives, Bennett said without hesitation. She seemed to consider this for a moment, then she reached up and pulled off what Rollins had thought was her hair. It was a wig. Underneath, her hair was cut in a shorter, more modern style. My name, Captain, she said, her voice clear and strong, is Clara Bennett, and we have a very big problem. Rollins was stunned into silence. This was Bennett's daughter, the secretary, the spy he thought was trapped back in Rock Creek. You're supposed to be in town, he finally managed to say. I was, Clara said, but when Hayes arrested my father, I knew my cover was blown. I got out before they could connect us. She turned to her father. I managed to get most of the documents. She pulled a thick stack of papers from a leather satchel. Land deeds, water rights agreements, letters. Enough to ruin Hayes, she said, and Edward Wade. Iron Wolf's face grew dark at the name. Wade. He is known to my people. He was the one who led the cavalry at Sand Creek. Clara's mother, Rollins, remembered Bennett telling him. She was a survivor. Wade was at Sand Creek? Rollins asked, a sick feeling growing in his stomach. He'd served with the man for 2 years, fought beside him, bled with him, and he'd never known. The man he'd called his friend was a butcher of women and children. He was a lieutenant then, Iron Wolf confirmed, before he joined your regiment. The betrayal felt fresh, a new wound on top of an old scar. He's planning his masterpiece now, Clara said, spreading the map of the dams out on a buffalo robe. This isn't just about land. It's about extermination. Within a year, 8,000 Cheyenne, Lakota, and Arapaho will either starve or be forced to fight. And Hayes's militia will be waiting for them, Rollins finished. The scale of the evil was breathtaking. We need to get this to a federal judge, Bennett insisted. The nearest one is in Cheyenne, Clara said. 200 miles away. We'd never make it. They were trapped, outnumbered, with evidence that could save thousands of lives and no way to use it. Just then a young warrior burst into the teepee. Riders, he panted in Cheyenne. Many men, white soldiers, coming fast. Iron Wolf was on his feet in an instant. How many? 20, maybe more. 2 miles south. It's Wade, Rollins said, his voice grim. He tracked us. Bennett's face went pale. My God, I led them right to you. No time for blame, Iron Wolf snapped. He began barking orders in Cheyenne, and the camp erupted into a blur of controlled chaos. Women and children were being hurried into the trees to the north. Rollins grabbed Iron Wolf's arm. We have to lead them away, create a diversion, you, me, and Bennett. He glanced at Clara. Your niece should go with the others. I'm staying with my father, Clara declared, slinging the satchel of documents over her shoulder. This evidence is our only chance. I'm not letting it out of my sight. Roland saw the same stubborn fire in her eyes that he'd seen in her father's. There was no arguing with it. Fine, but you follow my orders. Both of you. Iron Wolf clasped Roland's arm. Like old times, brother, drawing the enemy's fire. Let's hope this ends better than the last time, Roland said grimly. They mounted up and rode east, deliberately leaving a clear trail in the snow for Wade's cavalry to follow. They were the bait, and the trap was closing in behind them. They rode hard, pushing the horses, always keeping Wade's pursuit just close enough to see their dust. By midday, Rollins led them into a narrow canyon, a natural choke point with sheer rock walls. "Dismount," he ordered. "We make our stand here." "A stand?" Bennett asked, alarmed. "I thought we were running." "We are," Rollins said, setting up his Winchester behind a large boulder. "But first we have to convince them they have us trapped. When they charge in, we slip out the back." Clara pulled a Spencer carbine from her saddle. She handled the weapon with a familiarity that surprised Rollins. "Harvard offers more than just language courses, Captain," she said with a dry smile. The thunder of hoofbeats echoed through the canyon. Rollins peered around the rock. A full platoon of cavalry, 20 men in blue, trotted into view. And at their head, sitting tall in the saddle, was Major Edward Wade. His beard was streaked with gray now, but the cold, calculating look in his eyes was exactly the same. "That's him," Clara whispered, her voice tight with a lifetime of hate. Rollins nodded. "Listen to me. When I open fire, you and your father take the horses through that crevice behind us. It leads out of the canyon. I'll hold them off and catch up." "You're staying?" Bennett protested. "Just long enough to make them think we're all here." But before Rollins could give the signal, Clara grabbed his arm. "Wait, something's wrong." Wade had moved to the front of his column. He raised his saber. Tied to the tip was a white handkerchief, the universal sign for a parley. "Captain Rollins!" Wade's voice bounced off the canyon walls. "I know you're in there. I request a conversation under a flag of truce." "It's a trap," Bennett hissed. "Probably," Rollins agreed. "But I'm curious." He stood up, his rifle held loosely at his side. "I'm here, Wade. State your business." "Permission to approach," Wade shouted back. "Alone." Rollins hesitated, then gave a sharp nod. "Come ahead. Unarmed." Wade dismounted and walked into the canyon, his stride as confident as if he were strolling through a park. He stopped 30 paces away. "It's been a long time, Ethan," Wade said, his voice laced with false familiarity. "Not long enough, Edward," Rollins replied. "What do you want?" "To offer you a way out. Give me the lawyer and his daughter, and you can ride away. Go back to your ranch. Forget any of this ever happened." "And the Cheyenne?" Rollins asked. A coldness crept into Wade's eyes. "The Indians are not negotiable. They are an obstacle to progress. The West is changing, Ethan. There's no place for them anymore." "You mean you'll slaughter them?" Wade shrugged. "Progress requires sacrifice. The war should have taught you that. The war taught me that men like you use words like progress and necessity to justify butchery," Rollins said, his voice dropping. "What happened to you, Edward? You were a good officer once." A flicker of something, regret maybe, crossed Wade's face. "You destroyed my career, Ethan. You reported me. I had to find a new path. Hayes gave me one. And all it cost you was your soul." Wade laughed, a harsh, empty sound. "We left our souls on the battlefield at Antietam. All that's left now is survival. Join me, Ethan, one last time for old time's sake." He held out his hand. Rollins just stared at it. "I can't do that." Wade's expression hardened. He dropped his hand and turned to leave. Then he stopped. "For what it's worth," he said, looking back over his shoulder, "I did try to spare her. And the boy." Rollins froze. "What did you just say?" Wade watched him, a cruel smile playing on his lips. "The fever that took your wife and son. It wasn't an accident, Ethan. Hayes wanted the water rights on the adjacent property. You wouldn't sell, so he took more. Direct measures." The world tilted on its axis. The wind died. The sounds of the canyon faded away. All Rollins could hear was the blood pounding in his ears. "You poisoned them," Rollins whispered, the words barely audible. "It was meant for you, of course," Wade said, as if discussing a minor tactical error. "They were just collateral damage. A tragedy." The rage that erupted in Rollins was a physical force, a white-hot inferno that threatened to consume him whole. His hand tightened on his rifle, his finger on the trigger. He could end Wade right here, right now, but he didn't. With an effort that cost him everything, he reined it in. Killing Wade now would be too easy. It would be mercy, and Wade didn't deserve mercy. "You've delivered your message," Rollins said, his voice deadly calm. Now get out of my sight before I forget that white flag is supposed to mean something. Wade gave him a long, searching look, then turned and walked back to his men. Rollins stumbled back to the rocks where Clara and Bennett were hiding. Clara took one look at his face. What happened? What did he say? Change of plans, Rollins said, his voice like gravel. He swung himself into his saddle, his movements stiff, robotic. We're not running anymore. Captain? Bennett asked, his voice full of concern. Rollins looked down at them, and they saw a man they didn't recognize. The calm, principled captain was gone. In his place was something colder, harder, and infinitely more dangerous. He confessed, Rollins said, his eyes burning with a cold fire. He confessed to murdering my wife and son. He turned his horse, not away from Wade's cavalry, but back toward Rock Creek. We're going back, he announced, and we're going to burn Maxwell Hayes's empire to the ground. That night they slipped into Rock Creek like ghosts. The town was on edge, Hayes's men patrolling the streets. But Rollins moved through the shadows with a predator's certainty. He'd stopped being the hunted. Now he was the hunter. They found a safe house in a boarding house run by a widow whose husband had been ruined by Hayes. She hated the sheriff as much as they did. From their window, Rollins watched the town. He watched the patterns of the guards. He watched Hayes's saloon, a beacon of corruption in the heart of the town. He's doubled the guards at his house and the bank, Rollins observed. But the saloon, he's left it almost unprotected. That's his mistake. That's our way in. The saloon? Bennett asked. What's in the saloon? His real ledgers, Clara answered. She had spent the day in disguise, gathering intelligence. The ones that document every bribe, every land grab, every crime. But their plan to get allies was failing. The reservation agent, a corrupt man named McPherson, had been bought off by Hayes. He wouldn't help. We're running out of options, Bennett said, his voice heavy with despair. Not yet, Clara said. She pulled out a map, the same map of the dams they'd seen before. I've been looking at this. The location of the main dam. It doesn't make sense. It's not the most efficient place to block the river. Unless blocking the river isn't the only goal, Rollins murmured, a new terrible suspicion dawning on him. Clara pointed to a spot on the map just upstream from the dam site. There was a gold strike here back in '68. It played out fast, but there were always rumors that the main vein was never found. The pieces clicked into place with horrifying clarity. The dam isn't just for the water, Bennett whispered. It's a cover, a way to bring in men and equipment. He's reopening the mine, Rollins said, on reservation land. That's a federal crime. This was it. This was the proof they needed. Something so big, so blatant, that not even Hayes's money and influence could cover it up. We have to get to that dam site, Clara said. We need proof, photographs. But getting out of town was impossible. Hayes had anticipated them. He'd had every horse in every public stable removed. He was stranding them, tightening the net. The town itself was a trap. They were cornered, desperate. Their only hope was an undertaker named Sullivan, another man with a grudge against Hayes. He had a hearse, a multi-purpose vehicle, he called it, the perfect disguise. Just as they were finalizing their plan, the town marshal and his men surrounded the undertaker's shop. Someone had talked. They were trapped again. Sullivan hid them in a root cellar beneath his workshop. They huddled in the darkness, listening as the lawman searched the building above. The heavy boots stopped right over their heads. "What's this?" a deputy asked. "Root cellar," Sullivan's voice replied smoothly. "Open it," the marshal ordered. The trap door creaked open. Light flooded their hiding spot. Rollins drew his Colt, ready for the end. But the marshal just grunted. "What's that god-awful smell?" "Embalming chemicals," Sullivan said. "The fumes can be disorienting." The marshal peered into the darkness, his gaze seeming to pass right through them. He saw nothing. After a moment, he coughed and backed away. "Close it up. Let's get out of here." The trapdoor slammed shut, plunging them back into darkness. When Sullivan let them out, Rollins grabbed him. "How? He looked right at us." The undertaker just smiled and held up a small glass bottle. "Applied science, Captain. A little trick I learned in the war. A way to bend the light. An illusion. It was a miracle, a trick of the light that had saved their lives. But it was a temporary reprieve. They had to get out of Rock Creek. Now. They climbed into the hidden compartment of Sullivan's hearse and rolled out of town under the cover of darkness. A coffin on wheels carrying the seeds of Maxwell Hayes's destruction. The journey to the dam site was a descent into the belly of the beast. They traveled on foot through the last 4 miles of rugged frozen wilderness, guided by Sullivan. As the sun rose, they looked down from a ridge into the valley, and what they saw made their blood run cold. It was worse than they had imagined. It wasn't just a dam, it was an industrial operation. Dozens of laborers, supervised by armed guards, worked under the cold gaze of a stamping mill that crushed ore from a newly opened mine shaft. And overseeing it all, like a general commanding a battlefield, was Edward Wade. They needed proof, pictures, something undeniable. Clara, dressed in her Cheyenne buckskins, was the only one who could get close without being noticed. Rollins and Sullivan would create a diversion, a fire at the supply depot, a little bit of the Undertaker's applied science to create chaos. The plan worked. As multicolored smoke and loud bangs erupted across the camp, sending guards running in confusion, Clara slipped through the chaos like a phantom, a small camera clutched in her hand. She was getting the shots, pictures of the mine, pictures of Wade. But as Rollins and Sullivan were making their escape, a shot rang out. Sullivan went down, a dark stain spreading across his side. "Go!" he gasped. "I'll slow them down!" Rollins refused to leave him. He dragged the wounded Undertaker through the snow, guards closing in behind them. But it was no use. Sullivan was fading fast. They reached their rendezvous point, but Bennett wasn't there. He should have been. Clara appeared out of the trees, the camera safe. She saw Sullivan, and her face fell. "It's too late," the Undertaker whispered, his voice weak. He pressed a small derringer into Rollins' hand. "Leave me this. I'll buy you some time." It was a suicide mission, a final, defiant act. Rollins clasped the man's hand. There were no words. They left him there, propped against a pine tree, as the sounds of the pursuit grew closer. They had to find Bennett. Then they saw it, a wagon leaving the camp, heavily guarded, and being forced into the back was Daniel Bennett. He'd been captured. They had to get him back. Rollins and Clara moved through the mountains like wolves, circling ahead of the wagon, racing to set an ambush at a narrow creek crossing 5 miles from town. It was a desperate 2-person assault against a team of hired killers. They set traps. They planned their crossfire. And they waited. As the wagon splashed into the frigid water of Cottonwood Creek, the trap was sprung. Rollins's Winchester cracked, and the lead rider went down. Clara's Spencer took out the driver. The creek erupted in a flurry of gunfire. It was over in seconds. The guards were down. Clara ran to the wagon, calling her father's name. The canvas flap flew open, but it wasn't her father who stepped out. It was Edward Wade, and he was holding a Colt revolver to Daniel Bennett's head. "Hello, Ethan," Wade said with a calm, chilling smile. "I've been expecting you." The world narrowed to the space between them, the icy creek swirling around their boots. Wade stood half-shielded by Bennett, the barrel of his Colt pressed hard against the lawyer's temple. "Drop your weapons," Wade commanded, his voice as cold as the water. Clara kept her rifle trained on him. "Let my father go." "That's not how this works," Wade said. "Drop them, or he dies. Now." Rollins looked at the impossible angle. There was no clean shot. He met Clara's eyes. "Do it," he said quietly. "Trust me." With a look of fury and despair, she lowered her Spencer. Rollins let his Winchester fall. They kicked them away into the water. "A simple exchange," Wade said, his eyes flicking to the leather pouch at Clara's side. "The evidence for the lawyer." "Don't do it, Clara," Bennett choked out. "The evidence is more important." "You have 10 seconds, Wade snarled. "Wait," Rollins cut in. "A counteroffer. Let them go and you can have me. I'm the one you really want, Edward." Wade considered it. He knew it was true. The final piece of his past he needed to erase was standing right in front of him. "All right, Ethan," Wade said. "A partial exchange. The lawyer walks to his daughter. Then you walk to me." Bennett stumbled through the creek, his body bruised and broken. As he passed the halfway point, he tripped, falling to one knee. For a split second, his hand dipped beneath the water. Then he pushed himself up and continued to the bank, collapsing into Clara's arms. It was Rawlins's turn. He walked into the creek, his eyes locked on Wade. As he reached the spot where Bennett had fallen, he saw it, a glint of metal in the silt. Bennett hadn't just stumbled. He dropped his backup weapon, a tiny derringer. Without breaking his stride, Rawlins stepped on it, hiding it from view. "On your knees," Wade ordered. Rawlins knelt in the freezing water, his hand closing around the hidden gun. "Now, Miss Bennett," Wade said, turning his attention to Clara. "The evidence." In that moment of distraction, Rawlins moved. He exploded from the water, the derringer in his hand. Wade reacted instantly, his Colt roaring. The shot went wide. Rawlins's much smaller gun fired once. The bullet hit Wade in the shoulder, spinning him. From the bank, Clara's Spencer cracked, a second shot taking Wade in the thigh. He dropped to one knee, his gun lost in the current. He was beaten, wounded, disarmed. "Finish it, Ethan," he gasped, blood staining the creek. "You know you want to." The temptation was immense, to end it, to finally have his revenge for Sarah and James. Clara stepped forward. "Justice means you face the consequences, Major. Through the law you tried to twist for your own gain." "You'll never get a conviction," Wade sneered. But then he lunged, a sudden, desperate move for his fallen revolver. Rawlins reacted, but Clara was faster. Her Spencer fired one last time. The shot was perfect. It threw Wade backward into the water. He lay there, his eyes wide with surprise, a dark bloom spreading across his chest. Rawlins rushed to his side. The wound was mortal. Wade grabbed Rawlins's coat, his grip surprisingly strong. "Hayes! Nose!" he choked out, blood bubbling from his lips. "About the woman. What she really is. What are you talking about?" "Clara Bennett died in Boston 3 years ago," Wade whispered, his life fading with each word. "The woman, with you, is an imposter, a half-breed, playing a role. Nothing is what it seems, Ethan. Nothing." His hand went slack. His eyes stared sightlessly at the gray sky. Major Edward Wade was dead. Rawlins stood up slowly, Wade's dying words screaming in his mind. He turned and looked at the woman on the bank, the rifle still in her hands. "Is it true?" he asked. She didn't flinch. She leaned her rifle against a rock and met his gaze. "Yes," she said. "And no." "Then who are you?" She stood a little taller, a quiet dignity settling over her. "My name is Morningstar. Clara Bennett was my half-sister. Same father, different mothers. He adopted us both after Sand Creek. When she died of tuberculosis, I took her place. I took her name, her education, her life. It was the only way to get close to Hayes. A white woman's identity opened doors that would have been forever closed to me." The deception was staggering. Every moment, every conversation, replayed in his mind through this new lens. She had played them all. "The evidence," Rawlins asked, his voice rough. "Is it real?" "Every last word," Bennett confirmed from the bank. "The lies were personal, Captain. The cause has always been just." The world had been turned upside down and shaken, but the mission remained. They recovered what they could, loaded the wounded Bennett into Wade's wagon, and started the long, desperate journey to Cheyenne. The trip was a frozen hell. Blizzards, pursuits, and Bennett's failing health tested them to their limits. But through it all, Morningstar was a rock. She hunted, she nursed, she navigated. She was a survivor, forged in the fires of two worlds. They made it. Battered and exhausted, they stumbled into the office of Judge Thaddeus Williams, one of the few honest men in the territory. Morningstar placed the leather satchel on his desk. "It's all here, Your Honor." The judge examined the evidence, his face growing grimmer with every page. "My God," he said finally, "this is monstrous. It goes all the way to the top. I'm issuing federal warrants immediately." As they were leaving the courthouse, a deputy came running up the street shouting, "The telegraph from Rock Creek just came in. Sheriff Hayes is dead." "Dead?" the judge asked, stunned. Shot by his own men, the deputy panted. When word got out that feds were coming, he tried to run with the gold from the mine. They turned on him. The whole operation is tearing itself apart. It was over. Not with a trial, not with a hanging, but with the pathetic, greedy betrayal of thieves. Justice, it turned out, sometimes takes care of itself. That night, Rollins found Morningstar standing on a balcony, looking out over the lights of Cheyenne. The war was over. The ghosts were quiet. For the first time in years, Rollins felt a sense of peace. "What will you do now?" he asked. She smiled, a real smile this time, one that reached her startlingly green eyes. "The world has different paths for Morningstar than it did for Clara Bennett. Perhaps it's time I find my own." "I'd like to rebuild my ranch," Rollins said, his voice quiet. "Lone Pine. It could use new beginnings." He looked at her, and she looked back at him. An understanding passed between them, not a promise, just a possibility. The quiet hope that two broken people from two different worlds might be able to build something new together, out in the vast, unforgiving wilderness of Wyoming. The story of the West is written in blood and betrayal, but sometimes, if you're lucky, it's also written in second chances. If you enjoyed this story and want to hear more tales from the strange and shadowed corners of history, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. You never know what secrets the past is waiting to tell.